Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and we're talking about Canada during wartime, and we're talking about women getting the vote. So was everything okay after that? Or
no, of course not.
Something else to complain about? Or?
Yeah, something else to complain about. Yeah, you know,
Surprise.
women, as I said before, you know, they argued for the vote on all sorts of grounds. You know, it was the natural right as humans and as mothers and nurturers. And in the end, they get the federal vote in the hopes that they'll support conscription. So all those men hadn't even listened at all, but still they had the vote. And you had actually had women involved in politics by the war era, especially on the prairies where we know all the radical stuff going on, on the old prairies. So you had someone like Irene Parlby, for instance. She was president of the UFA, the United Farm Women of Alberta, 1915 to 1919, I think. And she's a really good example of a woman that's politically involved. She was born in England, lived in India while her father was in the army, met and married a Canadian in 1897, and then he brought her home to that huge metropolis of Alex, Alberta, not a metropolis at all. And she's not your typical farm wife. She's she had lots of experience doing all sorts of things, and she becomes the first woman cabinet minister in Alberta. And there are some other women as well. In 1917, you have Mrs. Louise McKinney elected in Alberta as well. And Emily Murphy. Emily Murphy became the first female magistrate in the British Empire, all in the Canadian West. So you have this, as we've seen, this federal act passed granting all women the right to vote, but that wasn't quite enough. It was close, but it wasn't quite enough, because if women were full citizens, which this seemed to indicate, you know, give you the vote, you're just like us. So if women were full citizens, then they should be able to sit in the House of Commons and in the Senate. Now, of course, this was what some of those guys had worried about, like, oh no, they'll elect each other. What will happen next? So that's okay, and you could actually get elected to the Commons. So that's fine. Like, oh, that's good. So if we can get elected to the Commons, we should be able to get elected, we should be able to get appointed to the Senate as well, right? So I'm like, oh, we should get Senate seats too. We should be able to sleep like all those other old guys that are in the Senate. That would be good. Maybe the women would have knitted instead of sleeping. So what happens next is actually called the Persons case. With my accent, I should spell it P-E-R-S-O-N. Yes, the Persons, not the Parsons. The Persons case. And so the question that politicians were asked was, if women are full citizens, can they take a seat in the Senate? And women thought, this should be fine. There shouldn't be any problem with this at all. No. So in the British North America Act, Section 23, it uses the pronoun he all the way through it. And of course, it's only fathers of Confederation, right? Daddies of Confederation. And in British North America Act Section 24, it says that the Governor General can summon qualified persons to the Senate. So the question that was put before Canada was, are women persons in the law? And of course, women were like, well, sure we are. Like, we physically exist. Yeah, we're here. And of course, it didn't appear to be so. So 5 women from the West mounted a court challenge, and they're called the Famous Five, like an Enid Blyton story. The Famous Five: Emily Murphy, who've mentioned, Nellie McClung, who we heard from, Louise McKinney, who spoke about, Irene Parlby, and Henrietta Edwards, and they always go by alphabetical order, so it's Edwards versus the Attorney General. And they petitioned for an order in council, the Famous Five, directing the Supreme Court to rule on the question. And of course, the Crown argued that in 1867 there were no women in politics, therefore the Fathers of Confederation didn't intend to include women as persons. The case took 6 weeks to decide, and in the end the Supreme Court said that women were not persons in the law. Boo-hoo. So they weren't eligible to sit in the Senate. They couldn't sit in the Senate. So of course, what do you do? Is there another court that you could go to? beyond the Supreme Court of Canada.
Well, I've never been in that situation.
Well,
being a man.
if you ever are, or if you'd been alive then, and yeah, of course, because you have full rights and everything goes well for you. But if you had ever run into a little wrinkle, you would have gone to the JCPC, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London. So remember the Supreme Court of Canada, because we talked about this before. I'm shocked that you didn't remember. Alexander Mackenzie, great Supreme Court of Canada, 1870s member, and
blah, blah,
but
blah,
still,
yeah,
highest court of appeal outside the country. So if you don't get justice at the Supreme Court of Canada until the late 40s, you could go to the JCPC. But of course, it always took a bit of time because there's cases coming in from all across the empire. So the JCPC heard this on appeal in July of 1929 and reversed the Supreme Court decision and said, yes, women are persons in the law. The Privy Council said that the wording of the British North America Act was ambiguous, and they couldn't really say anything else because the same thing was going on in Britain as well. So you couldn't really say, well, we can have it, but you can't have it. So really, a really interesting case called the Persons case, and there are statues all across the Western Canada. I'm sure there's a couple in Calgary. There's one in the house outside the House of Commons. There's one in Edmonton. They're all over the place. We have the Emily Murphy's house is up by the High Level Diner, which is up by the University of Alberta. There are just kind of, statues to these women all over the place. In fact, they were on the $50 bill, the Persons. The famous five, and they were taken off when they redid there's this big fuss about this. I don't know if you travel in the same financial circles I find myself in sometimes. Not really, but sometimes when you use the ATMs, they give you $50 bills that you can't spend anywhere. So the new ones, they've replaced the famous five with an icebreaker. I was really mad. An icebreaker instead of the famous five. But terrible. Still, what can you do? I suppose it was men on those icebreakers as well. Probably some guy made the decision, so it's very annoying. So women officially become recognised as persons in law, and everybody thought that the woman who had been the driving force behind the case would be appointed to the Senate, and that would have been Emily Murphy. But because of the way the Senate works, is the same way it works in the modern period, she was a conservative, and the federal government at the time was liberal, so they're like not going to give a conservative a seat.
Yeah.
And then instead of that, a Mrs. Corrine Wilson of Ontario, a stout-hearted liberal woman, she was active in a number of charities. I think she was maybe one of the founders of the VON, the Victoria Order of Nurses, and she was an organizer for the YWCA. She was also one of the founders of the National Federation of Liberal Women, and her father was a really well-known politician. She looks like the Wicked Witch of the West, though, kind of like really old-fashioned, clunky shoes and stuff, not a page 3 girl. So Mrs. Corrine Wilson, she was appointed in February of 1930, and there's a bust of her at the House of Commons. I don't know where her own bust is, but there's a bust of her at the House of Commons, and behind it there's a plaque honouring the famous five. And there's a park, not a plaque, but a park in Edmonton named after Emily Murphy. It's down the bottom of the hill, down from the University of Alberta. And the sad thing is that when another vacancy came up in the Senate in 1931, Emily Murphy didn't get it again because the senator who'd held it had been Catholic and she was Protestant. So she died in 1933 without ever actually sitting in the Senate at all. But nonetheless, a really important case. Been a lot of work done on it recently, and there's a really interesting article in the Beaver called "The Person Behind the Persons Case," and I'll just see if I can quickly summarize this for you. I'm not sure if I could do it properly or not, but it was about Lizzie Cyr, CYR, who was a Métis woman who was considered to be a vagrant at the same time, and she was, and this is all kind of to do with the Persons case. So she was, although it's not obviously apparent at the beginning, she was turned into the police on the 17th of May 1917 by a man who said he had paid her $10 for sex, and she had become ill, and she'd asked if she could stay at his house for another night. And a few days later, he found out that he had gonorrhea. It turns out he'd had it before, and it was just an uncleared up case. But he went to a pharmacist, got some medicine, went and found her and told her that she had to pay for his medicine or he'd turn her into the cops. And she said, well, I don't have any money. So he turned her in, and she was charged as a vagrant. So kind of an interesting kind of case, a poor soul. So she's tried right away, no jury. She's defended by John McKinley, who's a really brilliant lawyer who did a lot of pro bono work, and said, you know, there were lots of women that don't earn money and aren't vagrants, and so he got her to plead not guilty. And he pointed out that the man, John James Ryan, hadn't actually gone to the doctor at all, and that Ryan was actually the one that was the risk to spread the disease, obviously, because he slept with prostitutes. And unfortunately, Ryan looked quite good because he had a job and he had a home, and he said that, you know, Lizzie was the one that posed the risk, and he accused her of sleeping with Chinese men. Now, we've been through this before when we talked about the negative immigration policy, so that was a really horrible thing. So like, oh, she's down in Chinatown. So the judge was Alice Jamieson, and she decided she'd heard enough, and she sentenced Lizzie to 6 months hard labour. So they appealed the ruling, and this is interesting because the appeal on the ruling was that as a woman, Jamieson was incompetent and incapable of being a judge.
Huh.
Right? So this like kind of feeds into the later thing, like how can this woman possibly be a judge? And it turned out that it says in Sarah Barton's article that women judges were harder on cases than men would have, these kind of cases than men would have been, and gave Lizzie Sear the maximum. So the lawyer appealed the decision, and Alice Jamieson's right to hold office, and he lost both. So Alberta became the first province to legally endorse women's rights as persons to hold legal office, November 26, 1917. And then Sear served her 6 months, and then later on all they know is that she was working as a waitress in a cocktail bar. No, working as a waitress in Pincher Creek later on. So a really interesting kind of approach into the whole question of are women persons, and do they have the right to this kind of stuff.
Indeed.
Yes.
So let's talk about the economy a bit during World War One.
Okay, not as much fun as talking about women, but still. The Canadian government, of course, during the war had to intervene in the economy. Canada is, as we know, export-oriented, and so it would suffer all sorts of disruptions during the war because the seas were unsafe until they got the convoy system in place. Britain was the #1 partner of Canada in terms of trade in before the war, and then by 1918 Britain becomes #2 partner, and Canada kind of shifts towards America, so it become more kind of continental than imperial. But on the eve of the war, up to 1913, Canada's in a boom cycle. Between 1913 and probably a year into the war, we're in a recession, so there's very little credit available from Britain, especially after the war starts. The international economy no longer healthy, too difficult to get goods across the sea, and some of the signs of trouble are usually imports and exports. So in 1913, imports into Canada exceeded exports. That's never good. So we had $443 million worth of exports and $655 million in imports. So that's not a good balance of trade at all. Also, the housing trades were in crisis. The permits to build dropped by 85% in the West. There's increased unemployment, low land prices. There's an increased number in bankruptcies. So Canada's in really bad shape as it goes into the war. So increase in bankruptcies. The value of companies failing in 1913 were the value in was estimated to be $8 million. By 1914, it's up to $13 million. And the liabilities of the Grand Trunk Pacific and Canadian Northern, the train lines, were $1.8 billion. And all the railways except for the CPR kind of collapsed during the war. So really bad. And of course, they employ lots of people. So you have the railways alone laying off 50,000 workers. And we talked about the slowing of immigration as well. And there are also poor crop yields out west after 1914. So really in quite a bit of trouble. But war, what's it good for? Some people say absolutely nothing. Other people say economic recovery. So there is economic recovery after 1915 because Britain needs war materials, war supplies, and Canada provides most of the kind of ammunition and the wheat and the bacon. Wheat from the west, bacon from the east, from Quebec and Ontario. So Canadian exports, although they had been only in the 440 million range in 1913, by 1918 we're up to 1.2 billion. So just, growing by leaps and bounds. And of course, at the same time, imports decrease significantly because of the dangers of sea travel. So you're shipping the stuff out and you're getting it protected by convoys and you're not bringing as much in. So it's always really good. So everybody's making quite a bit of money off that. Also, one of the other things that happens is that Canadian manufacturing shifts from 7% to about 40%. And that's in part because of the orders received by the British as our number one ally. They received, for instance, in May of 1915, $170 million worth of munitions contracts just in a very, very short period. And the guy that's in charge, they have to, of course, this is the government has to intervene, right? Because it's made commitments to the allies. We'll give you so much of this, so much of that. So it has to now intervene actively in the economy. So what it does is it turns over a number of factories to wartime production, and it starts a thing called the Imperial Munitions Board, the IMB, the Imperial Munitions Board, headed up by Joseph Flavel, the pork king of Montreal. Oh yes, and it controlled 600 factories, mostly in urban Ontario and Quebec. So one of the things that happens during the war is that places that already had lots of factories get lots of deals, right? They get lots of contracts, and places that don't, like the West, they're going to fall behind because you don't want to have to build a factory. You just want to take over existing factories. So places that are already industrialized do better at this than anybody else. So for instance, February 16th to July 16th, 1916, Canada received $250 million worth of orders for to go through the IMB. So they just retool everything all for war production. So in terms of manufacturing and industry, things are going very well. Agriculture, not so well. People had petitioned after, we talked about this before, about settling the West. When we're talking about settling the West, that there's a kind of triangle called Palliser's Triangle that they thought people shouldn't settle in because it's just not suitable. But people had petitioned after 1910 to get land in Palliser's Triangle, and they were allowed to, and of course they take on extra debt, and in 1914 you get the first of a number of disasters. The crop yield dropped from 20 to 16 bushels an acre, and it just is going to get worse and worse after that. So you don't have to wait till the Great Depression for things to get bad out west. But again, the economy, even the agricultural economy, revives in 1915 because Britain says that it will take everything that Canada can produce. So in 1915, there are 360 million bushels of wheat at harvest bound for the other side of the world. And the British needed a steady supply because, of course, Russian shipments to Britain were disrupted, so they couldn't get anything out of the Baltic. So that meant what? That meant that the price held. So not only are they going to send a lot out, but they're still going to get, whatever it is. I think in the 20s, it's something like $2 a bushel, I think, at the top. So by 1917, Britain's taking all the wheat that Canada can export. The amount of land sown in the West increases by 50%. So people are like, whoa, just hold me back, Martha, this is great. The price of wheat rises to $2 a bushel, and it stays there. And property values increased in the West to about $90 an acre. And so one of two things started to happen. Either farmers kind of cashed in their chips and went, okay, that's it, it was good, I made a lot of money. Or else they bought more land and they bought new equipment and they really dug themselves in deep. And of course, this is going to have ramifications later on in the 1920s when things kind of collapse again after the fact. But as I said, the government intervened in the economy. So the government intervened also in the marketing of grain. You had in 1899 the Manitoba Grain Act. So they had already been involved in grading and transporting. And now the Canadian government is the one that commandeered, the large amounts of wheat and sold. So the Canadian government sold grain directly to the British government. And so they established a thing called the Board of Grain Supervisors to help with the logistics. And this, of course, is the ancestor if that's possible for a non-human thing, of the Canadian Wheat Board. So you have that. So the regional economy, in terms of regional economies, the government favoured industrial activity in Ontario and Quebec, but you see an increase in regional disparity and problems with on and off with agriculture out west, and also the Maritimes they don't really benefit much at all. They benefit a little with BESCO, that steel company, but as soon as the war ends, then that's, that kind of collapses. So in the Maritimes, manufacturing dropped from 11% to 6%, and they lost 45% of their manufacturing employees. So you have those kind of big things going on. And then the other thing is just the changing role of the government. So government budgets increased in 1913. So before the war, the government was spending on average, I think, about $185 million a year running the country. You'd probably spend that in about half an hour nowadays. So they often had surpluses in their operating accounts. And of course, they depended on indirect taxes from customs duties. So 2/3 of the money the government brought in came from that kind of revenue. From excise taxes. There's no personal tax and there's no business tax. And I think we mentioned this before when we were talking about World War I. So Borden, the Prime Minister, believed that he'd need maybe $50 million. Which is a lot. You run a country in 185, you're like 50 million, and that's as much as you're getting. So he thought that that would be enough to cover the costs of the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And of course, everybody thought the war would be over by Christmas, so you wouldn't really need much more. And he thought that you could raise that by taxing luxury goods and of course printing more money. But by the end of 1914, so the war starts in the summer, and by the end of 1914, the government had actually spent $246 million. So they'd hoped to spend $50 million for the entire course of the war, and they had spent $246 million. And by 1917, their annual expenditures were about $600 million. And at after the war, the expenditure still ran really, really high because they had to pay all sorts of veterans things and stuff. So the government had to move really carefully to avoid recession. They floated bonds in the New York and the London markets and raised about $45 million in 1914. And then they asked Canadians, they're like, could you buy some bonds? Never thinking that it would work, that Canadians had lots of money saved up. But they called for $50 million and they actually got $100 million. And by 1918, Canadians had funded the government in bonds worth about $2 billion. Canada's savings bonds, you gotta love them. So the absolute last thing is that in 1916, people were saying, all these companies are making a fortune with this Imperial Munitions Board. They should be taxed. So the government introduced a business profits tax. And then in 1917, they introduced the Dominion Income War Tax. So it was for men making $2,500 a year. They would pay $20. Most people made less than that, so it didn't really affect most people. And the promise was that it would be repealed after the war. And of course, the costs were so high by then that they couldn't repeal it at all. They had to service their war debt. And in as late as 1920, their war debt was running at $164 million. And of course, they had to pay disabilities and veterans benefits and pensions and all sorts of things. So because of that, we have income tax today, which we all happily pay around this time of the year. I believe this is when the government says, you haven't paid enough, Linda. I want more. And I go, no, please, please don't take any more. So so lots of changes to the Canadian economy during the war.
Yeah. Well, I think that about does it for us. Yes. We'll see you next time.
Okay, bye.